I came to art therapy with complex psychological difficulties, depression, anxiety, and I was having a real issue with dissociation. I was a bit apprehensive. I turned up and it was a bit awkward and I wasn't great with eye contact, and I suppose it particularly helped because I was struggling to verbalise things that were troublesome, and so using art materials meant that I didn't have to try and think about how I would articulate those problems, and particularly at the very beginning, where the therapist offered me clay. That was actually a fantastic way in. It didn't require eye contact, didn't require a great deal of conversation, although there was kind of gentle talking therapy going on, I think, simultaneously. The work at the beginning was quite a lot around identity. I made a little clay pot that had imprint of my palm, lines on it, and in that little pot I'd made little casts of my fingerprints and put them in the pot, so it kind of rattles and you can't see those. Yeah, that was quite an important bit, establishing where I was. Then there also came a point where I realised that I could write, I could use words, and that slowly helped to increase the kind of talking therapy aspect of things and communicate what my issues were. I didn't really quite know what was wrong with me, why I was struggling, and I really was in denial or just hadn't realised anything to acknowledge about my upbringing or childhood environment having any kind of correlation and impact on my adult mental health. The first thing I'd like to read is actually about some great input from the community mental health team, very strong and effective support that I initially had in the services, which did sadly deteriorate, and having a revelation about challenging the kind of entrenched opinion I had of myself and how difficult it was for me to accept that. So, rhyme and reason. The minutes tick until we meet. We drive, we take a usual seat. Make comment on my yellow dress. You coax a joke, dilute distress. Black coffee bests my bitterness, and smoke brings out your tenderness. You know, and yet you cannot know. The fear, the lack of orientation, the dread and dreaded full frustration, wit's end of tether. Behaviour I can't recognise, reflection of some other eyes. Our conversation lurches, leans, interpret what the other means. I push, expect you're steadying, except there's none, you pull away, suggest some time, another day. I don't want time, I don't know what you're getting at, and still I trust you. Trust your iron will, that grit, resilience that I lack. You demonstrate and offer back words that I'd use a different way. Twist into awful speculation, but you ignite a revelation. Damn, you're right. I do not argue, mind alight. Your surety, on which I count, squares up to me with reasoned truth. Accept this. Ever since my youth, I've done this. Hate and loathing, berate and scold myself. It's the only way I know me, with contempt. And with contempt, I've treated those who threaten my opinion of myself. It couldn't be much lower. You watch me think it through. I say it slower. I struggle with people who threaten my opinion of myself. The sort of colours that I don't generally use really represents how the therapist helped me nurture a playful streak and understand how important a playful streak is. And something else that's kind of relevant, I think, about this piece is that it was done at the very end of a session, haphazardly, offhand, kind of just threw some paint down and had fun doing it. And that sort of often seemed to be the way that at the end of a session, something important would come out. And maybe that kind of rush precipitated ad hoc pieces that were fun and I quite often actually liked. There was a lot of work within the sessions that I did not like, but this was fun and I like it. A piece with the turquoise splatters in this little circle of what were actually chewed up bits of paper. It looks kind of like confetti a little bit, with one corner torn off, a square corner, and that is what I munched up into these little bits and made the circle in the middle, and that sort of seemed significant that it took some destruction to make something. So that was actually in a way a bit of a healthy destruction, and I do like the piece. Kind of tying in with that, we had this scrunched up orange and black ball, which I actually now quite like, and I can't for the life of me remember what was in it, what was painted on the inside or written or drawn that I had such a problem with. But I obviously loathed it, couldn't stand to see it, scrunched it up and just dunked it in some paint, which looks quite cool now. But the point of this, well, these pieces in general, is that they represent the journey of learning how to not waste my energy concealing and changing something that I'd already done, and putting more effort into wanting to discard it than creating the original piece. And again, with the insight of the therapist that I was putting energy into mutilation rather than acceptance. We've got the wire word despair here, which I really like as a piece of art. It was good to play with a new medium and kind of be get physically involved with my hands. So I had this despair. It really summed up how I was doing at that point in time, how things went. But then I actually began to focus on the word peaceful, and the contrast of that with the despair was really quite striking. And the despair sort of dissipated a bit when I was focusing on peaceful, which we used in Safe Place, and it cropped up in a few pieces of art as well. This painting, which again I actually really liked, just that it's a very distressing subject, but I was really pleased with the outcome of this. It really represented the mirror that I was going to focus on in the EMDR work. I liked it so much, actually put initials on it as a little signature, which I think was the only time I ever put myself to any of the art that I made. And this was also massive in terms of finally admitting that the environment I was in as a child did actually have an impact. And that huge step was all thanks to months of good art therapy and talking with the therapist. Kind of this led into the beginning of the EMDR. I wanted to say that although that first round had been very grueling, it was incredibly successful, and the time and care of the therapist was crucial. What differed about that first round was that we undertook that when I was otherwise fairly stable. Whereas in contrast with this second round, which I did really want to do, I was definitely less stable, which does show the importance of only undertaking EMDR when service user is sound. Yeah, I don't need to be sedated, I need to be stable. And we also had all the no's, no, and some, slightly kind of destroyed and torn and stabbed by the looks of it. Paper with a lot of writing at the top, mainly no's, and then some very kind of self-berating bits, and a piece that quite literally says help. So these were all kind of a week or two between each other and show that trajectory depicting before. So I don't need to be sedated, I need to be stable was before the episode. Help was during. Tranquilized, not tranquil, I did at home. The therapist had very thoughtfully and with foresight given me a notebook, understanding that was super crucial to maintain a creative and indeed a playful output. And it was really cathartic for me, cutting up letters from the box of the medication that had sent me very, very unwell and into hospital. The green brushstroke with the silver, that's important to me, as that's quite a comforting method that felt familiar. So I'd kind of done these kind of brushstrokes throughout art therapy since I began playing with the paint. But throughout this and doing the art at home, iterated that the impetus was really on me to get myself better rather than having the appropriate help and care. This is a poem called Let Down. I know my impact, exude gratitude and compassion for folk spread thin, but recognise the state I'm in. Frayed seems, it seems, and yeah, afraid. For me and for systemic failing, wary lack of trust prevailing. I'm generally a patient, but it's legitimate frustration when in distress and vulnerable, the hands you're in aren't competent or capable or caring. It gets wearing, trying to explain the gravity of all the pain, the extent of fragility, when others can so clearly see the crumble and calamity. And people placed and paid to help fall short time and time again, as time ticks on from now to then, the clock's at odds, and even when wit's end reels me in or casts me out, there's nothing to lean on but doubt, a flimsy, failing, fault-filled wall that doesn't reassure at all. Which kind of brings me on to a point of longer term therapy being so incredibly important, probably for many people referred, where they might struggle to build rapport, as I did. It took several months, I think, to really get to a point where we were doing kind of really probing work. and only slowly coming to see and acknowledge the roots of problems and so forth. But it's really important that the sensitivity of the process is recognised and it needs time to be given a fair chance to work. And also really important for other departments within the service to see its value and not just think it's some sort of wishy-washy thing that somebody goes to. It's really the most valuable part of my treatment. And in fact, all the psychiatrists that I saw had the consensus that talking therapy would be the mainstay of my treatment, not medication. And that was absolutely right. And it feels like now we're carrying on with medication, which has dreadful side effects, rather than carrying on with therapy, which is valuable and consistent and helpful, which is a shame. Again, these are quite unusual colours for me. The orange-black sort of cages, or I'm not really sure if that's the right word, with a little silver dot in, which I suppose represents me. At the time I made these, so I was very, very depressed and trying very hard not to revert to those default sort of suicidal ideation issues, which again had been quite prominent in art therapy about, was that even in a way comforting to me because I'd defaulted to that for so long. But actually at this point I felt very at risk and not really safe. This was following a feeling that recovery was genuinely possible, and I really didn't want to lose that, try and hold on to that glimmer. In the art therapy session of these two particular pieces, we discussed perspectives and reframing, which I think is very evident from these kind of bars. Am I within? Am I without? Are they oppressive? Are they safe? But in that sort of reframing and keeping hold of the possibility of recovery, we covered sort of the importance of joy, even for a few seconds, and where I had this tendency to reframe experiences as negative and any positive things felt like anomalies. I kind of took time to really think about just appreciating things, nature and all that kind of stuff, which was in my consciousness but had sunk, and it really helped me foster an ability to shift viewpoints, very helpful revision. So we've got a giant no with the words diplomatic, invalid, as in invalid and invalid. And then the brush strokes, which I, as I said, were a technique that I found comforting and familiar with, and a splatter, which I quite often did as well. Very messily, by accident, the words defiant resignation. And I think these relate to systemic thinking and how I thought about myself within the family. Reiterate that point about the importance of systemic thinking across the services as well as for the actual service user. I think these words also poignantly relate to how I relate to the services overall, and from this point and this acknowledgement of who and how I felt I began to participate in things which hopefully do give me a voice in changing the services to some extent, and canvas people in a similar position, service users or ex-service users, give them a voice as well. And I think it's important to remember that legitimate anger is valid as long as it's channeled correctly. So for me, it's crucial that if I'm frustrated or angry at something, I must channel it into that and into trying to initiate change than turn that anger inward to myself, which I do have a tendency to do. Have no hesitation in saying that I don't think I would be here if it wasn't for the therapists and the art therapy services. And I wouldn't have ever thought that was something that would be useful to me, but it really is.